Hello dear students and welcome to this new lesson in the series of English lessons on the Anwar Satellite TV channel. Welcome back. Dear students, sometimes we advise certain people to do something. Some other times we obligate people to do something. Sometimes we are obligated to do certain things by certain people. Do you know how to give advice to one of your friends? Then follow us in today's lesson, Expressing Advice and Obligation. Our lesson today is Expressing Advice and Obligation. Now, dear all, to start our lesson, let's look at this teacher talking to his students. Let's read what the teacher is saying.
When you write a story, you must use correct punctuation marks. You must start a sentence with a capital letter, and you mustn't forget to put a punctuation mark at the end of it. To make your writing more interesting, you should try to use lots of descriptive words and phrases. You don't have to write the story from your own personal point of view, but it's better to try to write about something you know about. Before you start, you should write a plan of what you are going to say. And when you finish, you should always read your work through checking carefully for mistakes.
Okay, after we have read what the teacher has said, let's go through some questions. Let's have question number 1. In the first question we have, what must students do when they write a story? What must students do when they write a story? What must they do? Do you remember? Then let's get back to our paragraph. In the paragraph we have, when you write a story, you must use correct punctuation marks. When you write a story, you must use correct punctuation marks. So, let's get back to the question again. What must the students do when they write a story? What must they do? Of course, the answer is, they must use correct punctuation marks and they must start a sentence with a capital letter. Again, they must use correct punctuation marks and they must start a sentence with a capital letter. Let's have the second question. What mustn't they do when they write a story? What mustn't students do when they write a story? Let's get back to the paragraph. In the paragraph we have, you mustn't forget to put a punctuation mark at the end of it. The teacher says, you mustn't forget to put a punctuation mark at the end of it. So, in the question, what mustn't they do when they write a story? What mustn't the students do when they write the story? Well done. Thank you very much. Here, they mustn't forget to put a punctuation mark at the end of the sentence. Again, they mustn't forget to put a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. Let's go on to the next question. What should the students do to make the writing more interesting? The question again. What should the students do to make the writing more interesting? What should they do? Then let's get back to our paragraph. In the paragraph, the teacher says, to make your writing more interesting, you should try to use lots of descriptive words and phrases. Let's read it again. The teacher says, to make your writing more interesting, you should try to use lots of descriptive words and phrases. So, the answer to this question, what should the students do to make their writing more interesting, is like this. They should try to use lots of descriptive words and phrases. The answer again, they should, the students should, try to use lots of descriptive words and phrases. Let's go on to have the last question. What should the students do before they start and when they finish writing? The question again. What should the students do before they start and when they finish writing? In the paragraph, the teacher says, before you start, you should write a plan for what you are going to say. And when you finish, you should always read your work through checking carefully for mistakes. So, Let's get back to the question. What should the students do before they start and when they finish writing? Let's look at the answer. Before they start, they should write a plan, and when they finish, they should read their work. Again, before they start, they should write a plan, and when they finish, they should read their work. Now, dear students, let's have a closer look at some sentences. So far, dear students, we have seen many words like should, must, have to, and other expressions. In this part, we are concentrating on the use of should, shouldn't, ought to, and had better. So, in this part, we are handling should, shouldn't, ought to, and had better. Now, let's have some sentences with a closer look. Let's have a closer look on some sentences. The first sentence, the teacher says, in your writing, you should use lots of descriptive words. Again, in your writing, you should use lots of descriptive words. The teacher used should. Let's look at the second sentence. Here, the teacher says to his students, you should make a plan of what you are going to write. You should make a plan of what you are going to write. Let's move to the next sentence. In this sentence, the teacher also says, you should always read what you write to check for mistakes. You should always read what you write to check for mistakes. Here, dear students, in these previous three sentences, the teacher used should. The teacher used should. Now, let's look at the structure of ought to. In this sentence, you ought to leave soon, it's quite late. You ought to leave soon, it's quite late. You ought to go and see him today. Again, you ought to go and see him today. From these sentences, dear students, we can conclude the use of should and ought to. So here we have a question. Why do we use should and ought to? Do you know the answer? Then let's look at the use of should and ought to. Here, we use should or ought to plus base verb to express advice. So, dear students, when you'd like to advise someone to do something, you use should or ought to plus the base form of the verb. I mean verb 1. So let's read it again. We use should or ought to plus the base verb to express advice. So, to express advice, we use should or ought to. Don't forget that. Now, let's look at the positive form of should. Let's read this sentence together. You should stop smoking. It harms your health. Again, you should stop smoking. It harms your health. Here, dear students, we can imagine a friend advises his friend. So, a friend says, you should. He cannot say you must because he's offering an advice. He's advising his friend. So let's read the sentence again. You should stop smoking. It harms your health. Look, dear students, after the structure of should, we use stop. It's the base form of the verb. Is this structure in the positive, in the affirmative form, or in the negative form? Is it affirmative or negative? Wonderful, thank you very much. It's in the affirmative form. It's in the positive form. Here, you should. So, the positive form is structured like this. Should plus the base form. Should plus the base form. Let's move to the negative form of should. We shouldn't eat lots of junk food. It's unhealthy. Again, we shouldn't eat lots of junk food. It's unhealthy. Dear students, here we have you shouldn't. It means we use should plus not. You shouldn't eat. We said before, after should, we use the base form of the verb. So, we form the negative form of should like this. Should plus not or shouldn't plus the base form. Shouldn't plus the base form. What about the question form? can you ask a question by using should? Wonderful. Let's look at this slide. Should or shouldn't he exercise every day to lose weight? Here we have a question. Should or shouldn't he exercise every day to lose weight? This is a question. So how do we form questions by using should? Wonderful. Thank you very much. Here we use should in the affirmative form or shouldn't in the negative form plus the subject plus the base verb, and at the end we have the question mark. So again, we use should or shouldn't plus the subject plus the base verb plus the question mark. Again, we have should or shouldn't he exercise every day to lose weight? And the answer can be yes, he should, or no, he shouldn't. Now, dear students, to practice all what we have talked about, let's have this dialogue at the dental clinic. At the dental clinic. Let's read the dialogue together. Here we have, Ali says, my teeth hurt a lot. My teeth hurt a lot. His friend Omar says, you ought to or you should visit the dentist. Here, Omar advises Ali to do something. Omar gives an advice. Omar says, you ought to or you should visit the dentist. Let's look at Ali. Ali replies, you are right, Omar. I shouldn't ignore that. You are right, Omar. I shouldn't ignore that. Here, the dentist says, you had better brush your teeth twice a day and you shouldn't sleep before doing so. Let's look at Omar. Omar said, yes, you ought to or you should do so every day, Ali. Again, yes, you ought to or you should do so every day, Ali. Now, let's look at Ali's response. Ali says, should I use a particular kind of toothpaste? This is a question. So, Ali asks, should I use a particular kind of toothpaste? Let's look at the dentist's response. Yes, you'd better use one against decay. The dentist says, yes, you'd better use one against decay. Here, look, dear students, here, yes, you'd better. You'd better means you had better. You had better. So, from this sentence, yes, you'd better use one against decay, we can conclude the use of had better. So why do we use had better? Let's look together. We use had better plus the base verb to express a strong advice or to tell people what to do. Again, we use had better plus base verb to express a strong advice or to tell people what to do. So, when you'd like to give a strong advice, for example, from a doctor to his patient, we use you'd better. It's for strong advice. Here, the dentist said, you'd better brush your teeth twice a day. So far, dear students, in this part, we have talked about the use of should and ought to. And we concluded that we use should and ought to express advice. Also, we handled the structure of had better. And we said that had better is used to express strong advice. Now, let's have this short break to continue our lesson after it. Be with us. Welcome back. Now, dear students, it's the time to handle must, mustn't, have to, and don't have to. So in this part, we are handling must, mustn't, have to, and don't have to. Let's first start with must and mustn't. To start talking about must and mustn't, let's have a closer look at some of the sentences we mentioned in the teacher's class. Here, the teacher said to his students, when you write a story, you must use correct punctuation marks. The teacher said, you must use correct punctuation marks. Let's look at another sentence. He also said, you must start a sentence with a capital letter. You must start a sentence with a capital letter. He also said, you mustn't forget to put a punctuation mark at the end of the sentence. He also said, you mustn't forget to put a punctuation mark at the end of the sentence. Dear students, we use must and mustn't plus the base verb to express a strong obligation or prohibition, especially when it comes from you. Again, why do you use must and mustn't? Here, we use must and mustn't plus the base verb to express a strong obligation or prohibition, especially when it comes from you. A teacher says, you must do this. Here, by the use of must, it expresses obligation. So, he didn't use you should, because he's not giving advice. He's giving something obligatory. You must do this and you mustn't do that. Let's go ahead. In this sentence, I must go home now. My mother is waiting for me. I must go home now. My mother is waiting for me. This sentence, dear students, carries a kind of obligation. And this obligation comes from me. We said that we use must or mustn't to express obligation or prohibition, especially when it comes from you, from the speaker himself. So here, I must go home now. My mother is waiting for me. So the obligation comes from me, myself. Let's go ahead. You mustn't come to school late. You mustn't come to school late. This sentence carries a kind of a prohibition. It carries a kind of obligation and prohibition. Here, a head teacher says to one of the students, you mustn't come to school late. Here, he's not advising him to do something. In this sentence, dear students, the head teacher is not advising the student to do something. He's obligating him to come early. He says, you mustn't come to school late. And this sentence also carries a kind of a prohibition. So, he's prohibiting the student from coming late. Let's go ahead. In this sentence, in English, you must start a sentence in a capital letter. Look again. In English, you must start a sentence in capital letter. Look at the structure of must. Is it in the negative form or in the affirmative or positive one? Here, you must start. Of course, dear students, this is the positive form of must. What comes after must? Of course, verb 1, the base form of the verb. So let's look at the structure of using must. Here we use must plus the base form. Must plus the base form. Let's look at the negative form of must. You mustn't be late. The bus won't wait for you. Again, you mustn't be late. The bus won't wait for you. Here we have mustn't. Must plus not. Mustn't be. So the structure of the negative form of must is mustn't plus the base form. Mustn't plus the base form. What about the question form? Must or mustn't we answer all the questions? Must we answer all the questions? Or mustn't we answer all the questions? This is the question form of using must. So in the question, we use must or mustn't, plus the subject, plus the base verb, and at the end we have the question mark. Let's read the question again. Must we answer all the questions? Or mustn't we answer all the questions? This is the use of must. This is the way how we form positive, negative, and the question forms by using must and mustn't. Now, dear students, it's time to handle have to and don't have to. So in this part, we are handling have to and don't have to. Now, let's have these sentences. We have to wear a uniform to school. Again, we have to wear a uniform to school. Let's have another sentence. Students have to submit their papers today. Students have to submit their papers today. You don't have to write the story from your own personal point of view. Again, you don't have to write the story from your own personal point of view. Here we have don't have to. From these three sentences, dear students, we can conclude the use of have to and don't have to. So why do we use have to and don't have to? Why do we use have to and don't have to? Let's go ahead to conclude the use of have to and don't have to. We use have to or don't have to express a strong obligation, especially when it comes from someone else. Again, we use have to and don't have to express obligation and a strong obligation when it comes from someone else. Dear students, when we talked about must and mustn't, we said that must and mustn't express a strong obligation when it comes from you, from the speaker himself. But here, we use have to and don't have to express a strong obligation when it comes from somebody else. Let's go ahead. Look at this sentence. Maha has to arrive at work at exact 9 a.m. Again, Maha has to arrive at work at exact 9 a.m. Here, dear students, we have Maha has to, not have to. Why? Wonderful, thank you very much. Here, the subject Maha is a singular subject, so that we used has instead of have. But in case we have Maha and her sisters, a plural subject, we would say Maha and her sisters have to. What comes after has to or have to? Of course, the base form of the verb. So here, Maha has to arrive at work at exact 9 a.m. What happens if Maha, for example, doesn't go to work at exact 9 a.m.? Now, dear students, let's look at the structure of the positive form of have to or has to. We use have to or has to plus the base form. Have to if the subject is a plural, and has to if the subject is singular, plus the base form of the verb. What about the negative form of has to or have to? Let's look together. Students don't have to go to school on Fridays. Students don't have to go to school on Fridays. Here we talk about the students, a plural subject, so that we use don't have to plus the base form. What if the subject is singular? Let's look here. Ahmed, a singular subject, Ahmed doesn't have to go to school on Fridays. So students don't have to, but Ahmed doesn't have to. And after don't have to and doesn't have to, we have the base form of the verb. So the structure of the negative form is just like this. Don't or doesn't plus have to plus the base form. Don't or doesn't plus have to plus the base form. What about the question form? Let's look at it together. Don't students have to go to school on Fridays? Or, in the positive form, do students have to go to school on Fridays? Here we use do or don't because the subject is a plural. What if the subject is singular? Let's go together. Does Omar have to go to school on Fridays? What about the negative form? Doesn't Omar have to go to school on Fridays? Look, dear students, the subject here is Omar, a singular subject. So that we started our question with does or doesn't. And here we have to. Why have to? Because after do, does, and did, we use the base form of the verb. And have to is the base form of have. So in the question form, we have do or does plus the subject plus have to plus the base form. Again, in the question form, we have do or does plus the subject plus have to plus the base form, and at the end, of course, we have the question mark. Now, dear students, it's time to practice what we have talked about. Let's practice together. The first exercise we have is make sentences using should, ought to, had better, have to, must, mustn't, and don't have to. Let's go ahead. In the first sentence, we eat in the class. We eat in the class. Must we eat in the class? Wonderful, of course not. So let's make a sentence. The sentence says, we mustn't eat in the class. We mustn't eat in the class. Does this structure carry a kind of advice? Of course not. It carries a kind of obligation and prohibition. We mustn't eat in the class. Let's go ahead. I do my homework. I do my homework. In the sentence, I have to do my homework. I have to do my homework. Here, dear students, this sentence carries a kind of obligation. And this obligation comes from my teacher, for example. We said that the structure of have to or has to carries an obligation when it comes from somebody else. So, I have to do my homework, otherwise the teacher will punish me. Otherwise, I will not get high marks, and so on. I wake up early on holiday. I wake up early on holiday. In this sentence, I don't have to wake up early on holiday. I don't have to wake up early on holiday. I help my mother in the kitchen. I help my mother in the kitchen. Should you help your mothers in the kitchen? Of course you should help your mothers in everything they do. In the sentence, I should or I ought to help my mother in the kitchen. I should or I ought to help my mother in the kitchen. We go to school on time. We go to school on time. Must we go to schools on time? Of course, we must go to schools on time. So in this sentence, we must go to school on time. We must go to school on time. Now, dear students, let's have the last sentence. Ali improve his English. Ali improve his English. Let's look here. Ali has to improve his English. Ali has to improve his English. Now, dear students, let's have another exercise, which is choose the correct answer from the brackets. Choose the correct answer from the brackets. Number one, we ought or had better to leave soon. It's quite late. We ought or we had better. Look here, we have to leave. We ought to or had better to. Wonderful, thank you very much. Here, we ought to leave soon. It's quite late. We ought to. Why do we use ought to? Of course, we use ought to and should to express advice. Let's go ahead. You should or ought make a revision timetable. You should or ought make a revision timetable. What should we use? Thank you very much. Here, you should make a revision timetable. The next one, you ought or had better get up now. You ought or had better get up now. What do you think? Marvelous. Thank you very much. Here, you had better get up now. You had better get up now. Dear students, sometimes we can have the structure had better in the contracted form. So we can find it like you'd better. Instead of you had better, you can find it like you'd better, he'd better, etc. Let's go ahead. We have or must to wear the school uniform. We have or must to wear the school uniform. What do you think? Since we have to, then, thank you very much, we need to use have. We have to wear the school uniform. What's the difference between have to and must? Both express obligation. Have to expresses a strong obligation when it comes from somebody else. For example, obligation from your father, obligation from the head teacher, or so on. But must is used for expressing obligation when it comes from you yourself. Let's go ahead. Ola doesn't or don't have to prepare dinner. Her mom made it. Ola doesn't or don't have to prepare dinner. Her mom made it. Here we have Ola, a singular subject. Should we use don't or doesn't? Wonderful, thank you very much. Ula doesn't have to prepare dinner, her mom made it. So far, dear students, we have come to the end of our lesson. I hope the lesson was interesting and beneficial at the same time. Until I see you next time, have a good day and goodbye.